Good afternoon. We are now on the fourth Enterprise Innovation broadcast. My name is Matthew O'Keefe. I'm a corporate technologist at Oracle. And with me are Thomas Hudak and Randy Olinger, senior enterprise architects and developers in a very large enterprise that will remain unnamed. So Randy and I and Tom have done 3 shows, and we're really excited to have you here. A lot going on. And right now, when we were discussing the topic for the next show, we decided to talk about cryptocurrencies and the technologies underlying them, including, their open source nature, their characteristics. And what I wanted to hear from Tom and Randy is how is that affecting the big enterprises, that they're seeing, how is it affecting things in their own shop, if they can talk about it. So that's where we're at. So as everyone knows, blockchain in particular has been in the news a lot, reached a peak of almost $64,000 per Bitcoin unit. Elon Musk then made some noise, and it's been kind of oscillating pretty widely, but it's a very interesting technology. It's an open source project built on a protocol that lets people, distributed groups with no central control, really fairly adjudicate it. There's a lot of other cryptocurrencies. The core technology is blockchain. So maybe let's start there. Maybe I'll start with Randy. So maybe what you could do is just give us a little background on what blockchain is. It's been promoted for the enterprise for really the last 3-4 years. There's been a lot of enthusiasm. Kind of where do you think blockchain sits in the enterprise right at the moment?
Well, I mean, I definitely have opinions on that. The history, blockchain goes back till the early days of video. And early days of Bitcoin. I'm not exactly sure the date of that, but it'd be, before 2010. And, since then, people have looked for interesting applications for a distributed ledger between non-trusted parties. I think that's my kind of basic definition of a blockchain. Yeah. And in the enterprise, we keep thinking that there's great applications for that, but in the end, they tend to fizzle out because you can do the same thing with a regular old database if you have trusted entities. Yeah. I mean, you can do a distributed ledger with people all around the country if you want. It might not be real fast, but there's ways around that. There's other, we talked about Kafka in one of our other podcasts. There's other, kind of database technology that can deal with transactions in a distributed way. But when you've got untrusted entities and they have to kind of prove in some way that they're real, and then you want it to be cryptographically secure and kind of a write-only log, then you've got a blockchain. So in the healthcare industry, it has been surmised that maybe we could use it as a payment system or a way to reconcile payments between entities that tend to send a lot of money every day to one or the other. Mm-hmm. And if you're a large health insurance company, you might be sending a lot of money to hospitals and doctors' offices, and you might every day send the same ones a bunch of money. And it might be to your advantage to pay them once a week, but yet reconcile or do a promise to them once a day or something. I don't know, there's things you could do. But none of that has really come to fruition because I don't know if the value has been proven yet.
Mm-hmm. What about the difficulty of implementing it? I mean, if you look at how Bitcoin is implemented, it's peer-to-peer, distributed. Yeah. It requires a lot of application changes, business process changes.
Well, most of the vendors have just come up with hey, push your button and we'll give you blockchain type solution.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, you better trust your vendor. You better hope they know their security. And the cryptography, you better know where your keys are. So I don't think it's ever going to be just push the button because there's a lot of risk if you do it wrong. If your keys get out or your whole chain could be corrupted if your seed gets known. Mm-hmm. But in general, the technology has never really been the barrier for the projects that I've seen go by. It's really been the use cases that evaporate. Yeah. And it's complicated too. Try to explain to some hospital administrator why this blockchain is going to make their payment system better. It could be true, but it's not an easy sell.
Right.
So I'm not discounting it completely. I'm just saying it's had a hard time getting traction in our world.
Yep. What are your thoughts, Tom?
Most new things, they're exciting, and people who are really on the sort of technical forefront of new technologies or new industries do find use cases for them. There's lots of, plenty of examples of blockchain out there in the wild. The trouble comes with when you try and create a business solution or some sort of a solution that is tied to revenue streams, something that you can sell, right? Those things tend to get picked up later and later in the life cycle. Bitcoin is a bit unique in that it became very big very fast, right?
Right.
The value of it didn't, skyrocket till recently, but the actual technical feasibility, being able to transfer coins back and forth to one another, or in the case of like Ethereum, the ability to execute contracts where both parties agree, and then they don't have any ability to subvert that agreement. It's automatically reconciled in the ledger. Those are very useful capabilities. I think Ethereum probably has more promise from the perspective of being able to develop new tools or programs or applications or ways of conducting business between two parties or more than two parties than something like Bitcoin, which is really just going to be transactional monetary interactions, right? It's never going to, there's never going to be a point where you're going to execute an application and a contract will be guaranteed and processed as a result of that application ending up in the ledger and both people agreeing to the both sides of the contract. Mm-hmm. So the problem then becomes, like anything in business, right? Who do I sell this to and how do I sell it? What's the value? And that's, I think, where we're still sort of stuck in certain things, especially if you're talking about industries that have been around for a long time and have a very standardized way of doing business. To try and flip that on its head or upend it, you'll be met with a lot of institutional resistance. Right. I mean, I think you even see that in the financial sector, right? The hesitancy of a lot of these finance companies, whether it's private equity or investment firms or trading groups, not wanting to engage in crypto for a variety of reasons, right? Regulatory problems or inherent volatility. It just because it's so new, they just don't. It's not a stable, consistent, reputable thing that you could go turn around and build a product on.
But it's getting much closer. I mean, if you look at if you look like the press releases, if you read the financial press in 2018 versus today, I mean, you're literally seeing a flip. So there was something about when blockchain, when it hit 40 or 50K per Bitcoin, that something kind of flipped. And so anyway, so it's interesting. I know, Oracle, we're dealing with firms that are now, connecting Bitcoin trading into the traditional financial services industry. Coinbase just went public. I actually have a Coinbase account, so I play around with it a little bit. So all these traditional things that you do with a financial asset, like track, buying and selling and how much taxes you owe, you can now do with Bitcoin. So, and I think one of the things we were talking about, Randy, in our pre-call, just sort of deciding what we talk about, is there's sort of at some point, obviously people are concerned how governments will react, and there's one way of thinking is they're just going to try to stop it. The other way of thinking is they're going to ride the bandwagon and tax it. Or where do you think that's headed?
Well, I think it'll be both. I mean, they'll certainly try to tax it from a capital gains point of view. In the United States, for instance, is where it would make sense. When you cash out, it's treated like any other asset, and then kind of like drug dealers in the past. As long as you paid your taxes, you didn't really have to worry about the federal government too much. But ultimately, as a form of currency, most governments are scared to death because, that's one of the things in our Constitution in America that the government is actually supposed to do, right? Is supposed to mint and print currency and deal with money. And then we crafted a central banking policy out of that, but that's another podcast probably. But point being is they really, really, really like having the ability to manipulate the money supply to try and manage the economy, which I would say probably does more damage than good, but whatever. It's something that politicians really like. They're not going to let go of that without a fight, And the problem with Bitcoin is it's not managed by any one single central entity. Yeah. And it's not just in America. I mean, every large country in the world, every large free country and even non-free, manipulate their currency to their advantage at different times. And they don't like the idea of people using fiat or, trading gold pieces or chickens instead of using our trusty dollars. But just to jump back for a second to something Tom mentioned, I really do agree with something he said about smart contracts. I think that's an area where blockchain can be really useful because contracts are essentially agreements made between untrusted entities. And you want to have a way for people to meet, there are cases where you want people to be able to view contracts very transparently, but trust that they were signed or that they were executed by the people who say they're in. But you're like a third party. You don't really have a stake in the contract other than to validate the contract is there. An example would be a credential. So I'll say a certified financial planner. I don't know if they actually get credentialed, but let's pretend they do in every state. And let's say you're going to practice in 4 states. And then you're going to deal with a bunch of brokers or a whole bunch of other companies that all want to make sure that your credentials are kosher. The idea would be your credentials could be managed in a blockchain, certified, have a cryptographic key, kind of a proof of standardization. And you don't have to go to every single financial entity and prove to yourself and send them the particular documentation. They can just look you up in the virtual. Each state could set up such a system, but that's still not as good as having something that's a little more decentralized. Another example I've heard of where it's been used, or it's being proposed, I'd say, and been used a little bit, is in managing real estate in Africa, where the governments are just so unstable and they don't even have records of who owns what and what the property lines are. They're like, gosh, we really don't have a legacy system, so we have a chance to start over. So it's a great place to try something like an electronic contract and execute blockchain might be a really good thing. So I guess I should temper some of my earlier comments about it made it sound like there's not going to be a use for it. I was really pertaining to the large corporate enterprise, and it's having a hard time getting going. But there are places in the world where it's going to have a fit other than cryptocurrencies.
Sure. Yeah. And one of the things Oracle has developed I would call it a blockchain inspired addition to SQL, which is basically we call it blockchain tables. So it's not the peer-to-peer distributed, completely untrusted network kind of application, but what it does let you do is it helps you detect illicit changes, and it also allows you to have immutable tables. And I think AWS, their Q Ledger database service is similar. But basically, the idea is that you use this sort of cryptographic chaining concept from blockchain so that as you modify table entries, that's cryptographic. There's sort of a separate column for that series of cryptographic changes, which you can then mathematically verify. And you can sort of do it externally from the database. So if somebody maybe, for example, outside the database modifies the data, you can detect it then.
We used to have a business in that. I mean, we made write once optical media at a previous place of employment for me. And it was fascinating because we're like, it's going to change the world. We just got to get the courts to accept this, because paper up till then had been the non-changeable medium. Yeah. So signature on paper was kind of necessary. And we were trying to get people to accept, like if you had this write once optical, it's like a CDR basically that you would write to and you couldn't erase it. And ironically, the courts were like, okay, yeah, that actually makes sense. So they did accept that in many cases. But the dirty secret was it was actually erasable, but the firmware and the drive made it so that it couldn't be erased. So
I see. Okay, very interesting.
It's all dead technology now, so we can talk about it openly as well.
Well, would that be? I mean, is that the kind of capability with patient records? Obviously you don't want those modified, or if they are modified, you want to know who is modifying them, because I assume that's a fairly complex process or a fairly well-controlled process. Or how do you make sure that patient documents are immutable in some way?
A lot of times I've heard the word provenance be used. Provenance, not providence, but provenance be used for that immutability concept. Like, how do I know where the data came from, and how do I know that it's valid? And that is a big issue in the healthcare industry. It doesn't exist. I mean, it does to a certain extent. There are systems that have traceability in some places, but there's no standardized way, and it's certainly not cryptographically signed or secure. It's kind of haphazard. Different applications, home built or purchased, do it in different ways. I think there's money in those hills. So there's need there.
There's probably opportunities to provide access controls to that data as well through a blockchain, right? So you as an owner of a ledger of your records could determine who can and cannot see or optionally write to that data, and then through that access control mechanism, that can then be hooked into the upstream tools that allow, like a doctor, for example, to take notes or provide follow-up data to a past visit, right, without creating a whole new record that then has to be reconciled. So as a capability where two parties have to agree on what's going to happen inside the ledger, what records are going to be created, removed, altered, or whatever, even though the alterations are all considered to be new elements in the ledger, that would allow for a degree of control that I think we spend a lot of money and we pay a lot of attention, and we've built a lot of tools around how to do that in a safe, secure way that's also still accessible. But this would have that, effectively inherent in the system, right? I mean, the ledger's read only, so any past records that were inserted can't be altered, and any alteration would obscure the ledger, right? It would now be identified as, it's been modified, and it's been modified incorrectly, or it's been compromised. And
right.
At that point, if you were to mix things like the idea of Ethereum contract models with things like access controls, now theoretically you could have event-driven or event-based detection of attempts to access or subvert those ledgers and those record sets. I think the trickier part is nobody's moving to try and push all of the records into a blockchain. I think the blockchain becomes like the key to the door, right? The key is not the house. The key just gives you access to get in the house, right? The house is still the house. So all of our medical records are still stored in the house, right? We just change the door and we change the lock. And then we have better means of controlling who can have the key, and we also have a means of controlling who can't have the key. And you could do that in near real time, which is very difficult in most systems today, just because you have all this other reconciliation that needs to occur. And there's always trust, right? The cryptographic elements of it provide an inherent trust mechanism, because
I think we lost Tom's feed there.
Did we?
Yeah, he froze up. Hopefully he'll be back.
Okay. Well, yeah, just to continue, on that thought, that's what I think is interesting about blockchain, because, I mean, the whole point of it is to prevent changes that, going back in time, making changes and making sure that you can
without those keys.
Oh, there you go. Comes back. Yeah. We lost you there for a second. We lost you about the last 15 seconds.
Yeah, I'm not sure what happened, if I got some weather coming in or if my internet just.
Yeah, just go ahead and, if you want to just repeat about the last 20 seconds, your last thought.
I mean, it because it's inherent to the protocol and the capability, right? Now you don't need to have all of these large external systems and the management and the teams of personnel to manage and enforce those controls, or even define them. You can predefine contractual requirements that will then exist in perpetuity going forward. But giving people, you can extend that capability to the end consumer. To say, I don't want this, care provider to see my data anymore, or I do want to share this with my doctor and give that stuff over. But it's, the tricky part is you still have to route things back into where the actual data is going to come from if the data is not itself on blockchain or the distributed ledger.
I got some, there's some areas. I'm not by any means an expert either on the technology. I know when we heard people talk about all the solutions that are looking for this problem, they tended to be sucked into thinking it was just another database. It's like, well, if I use a bunch of spreadsheets today, I can shove it all on the blockchain, it'll be fine. And as long as your blockchain's like 10 blocks long, that's probably just okay, because it all fits in one disk seek. But I know there was one point where I was like, I'm going to try and go recover my 0.05 Bitcoins that I got from mining in 2013. But in order to do it, I need to set up a wallet, and I kind of fired up a thing to go do it. And after like 24 hours of this thing chewing really hard, I realized this isn't worth it. I don't care. Someday I might go back and
when it hits $1 million, you're really going to want that.
I know,
0.05
it'll when it's worth 50 grand. I'll probably. But it's
it takes a lot of Satoshis to actually be a lot of money these days.
Yeah, but the physical accessing of data in a blockchain, since it's kind of like you start at the beginning and then you just go forward from there. It's like, it seems to me, at least for Bitcoin, it's that way. I shouldn't say they're not all the same, but it as the chain grows, it's going to take longer and longer and longer for people to access data, to see a complete view of the data. Mm-hmm. And I know there are, like, Ethereum has different ways to segment out the tree and to build branches off and dead ends and stuff. But I just think that when people treat it like, oh, it's just another way to store data, it's like, well, yes, it is another way, and it's got specific use cases that make it useful. Yeah. And those are, kind of very bespoke and far between. But when it became sexy, everyone just wanted to use it for everything, and it turned into a joke, right? It turned into the laughing stock, and it really shouldn't have. It just got too much hype too fast. And, like when the tea company out in Connecticut decided to change their name to Blockchain Tea Company or something like that. they kept selling tea.
$1 billion company,
but their stock tripled overnight for being Blockchain Tea Company. I actually think that stock value maintained. It's not like it just went away when everyone figured it out.
Thing. I mean, going back to the original, I mean, essentially, it's the goal is to prevent illicit changes, so things like, I mean, there's interesting attacks these days, like students who break into their teachers, their teacher's account and change their grades.
God bless those kids. I want to hire that kid. That's awesome.
Yeah, but basically it's a pretty interesting way, or insiders, right? It's not just rogue hackers, but insiders that, potentially change.
90% of attacks come from inside the firewall.
Yeah. Yeah. So cool. So now, what about the so what's interesting? Another, very interesting aspect of Bitcoin and the other cryptocurrencies is here they're driving I think Bitcoin crossed the overall value, crossed $1 trillion sometime before, when it was above 50K. So this is very interesting to me because you're really you've got a protocol that supports sort of cooperation between peers with a set of rules to create a Bitcoin that requires a certain amount of work, and that work increases over time. There's only a fixed number of them. But then that's also implemented in an open source protocol and an open source code that, again, can be observed and can be worked on. So it's, again, that's also a cooperative enterprise. So it's kind of two levels of cooperation. So so to me, in some ways, yes, Linux is successful. Obviously, the internet protocols and many of them are open source and are also very successful. But I think in terms of pure dollar amounts and maybe economic impact, crypto, the open source that's driving crypto is I think it's impactful. So is it any thoughts on that, or what does it mean for just open source in general, if anything?
Good.
That's a good question. I mean, well, like any other open source project, right? When you get a certain amount of momentum and take the Linux kernel, for example. It's like first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they attack you, then you win. Right?
Yep.
I mean, Microsoft ignored Linux, then Microsoft laughed at Linux, made fun of it, thought it was just some hokey little thing. Then they started to directly attack Linux, and Linux ate their lunch, right? And the whole of the internet, built on Linux and like technologies. So those things have just inherent, there's an inherent good that comes from having something be open and free and shareable and manipulatable. Maybe not directly manipulatable, but the ability to fork and modify it to do something else, right? Mm-hmm. It helps to avoid the whole, recreating the wheel idea of, well, why do we need 50 different things that do the exact same thing, just with one little tweak here, one little tweak there? But but you can build on it, right? If
Yeah.
you want to take a different fork or trajectory, say you want Bitcoin, but you want it for an entirely different purpose than being able to trade currencies, right? You want to be able to trade goods, or you want to be able to have shipping manifests that are secure, so that you know what's on your ocean liner or what's in that uh, container, and know with accuracy. Those things have inherent value that is difficult to detach from
Right.
the idea of the blockchain itself and the very nature of the open source capability, right? The fact that there are so many variations on the blockchain approach. Look at how many different coins are out there, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's similar when Linux was getting started. Yeah. How many OSs did we, Unix OSs were there?
Yeah.
And
dozens.
Yeah.
It was actually, I think that was actually sort of one of the main problems with Unix, right? Is it became an incohesive, so that you had GNU, you had BSD, you had 100 other little, sub micro flavors. Every big corporation had their own variant, and each of those things had similar tools, but slight variation here or there. TAR is not the same thing on all Unix systems.
Yeah.
All kernels are not the same. Directory structure is not the same. Even though at its heart, the philosophy still is the Unix philosophy, and it's all built on those things. There were never 50 different versions of Windows, each their own variant with all their own little idioms.
Well, I don't know about that.
There's never two that were the same.
Well, at the very least, they came out of a succession. Yeah, right.
Well, that's interesting because you think about Linux. Like Oracle, we develop a version of Linux that specifically supports Exadata, but it's not. And then we feed all of our changes upstream, and generally they eventually get in. If they don't get in, then we have to reappraise. But it's sort of Linux is supporting some level of minor fragmentation that aren't full forks, but let you still innovate. I think.
But I mean, what I would say, Matt, is the Oracle version of Linux is actually the Linux kernel plus the utilities that they built around it to make it into a full operating system.
Yeah.
But the kernel, I mean, and they're putting drivers into the kernel. They're hacking the kernel a little bit, but like you say, they either push things upstream or they maintain a patch list. But it's it's for an appliance, and just like my cheap little internet router in my house, it probably has Linux in it. And it's probably got everything yanked out of it that wasn't a router.
And maybe even certain things built in that'll never be in the Linux kernel, right? Maybe somebody's got their own custom microcode for some hardware that they built in their router chipsets, wireless chipsets.
We're a little off topic, but that is truly the beauty of the Linux kernels that went modular so early on in its life cycle that people could add their own thing without breaking the entirety. And the open source nature of it let people propose their changes to Linus, and he could wave his wand. So, I mean, from a social construct, it really broke the mold in terms of how a large enterprise or a large thing, whatever you want to call it, could be managed at a global scale. It was probably the first, And Bitcoin is almost like a fast follower. There aren't a lot of things in that category. So, you know what? We may have made a connection there.
Well,
I just had sort of a, epiphany moment. So you remember back in, was it 99, we decided to change the license on GFS.
Well, that was actually about 2002.
It was 2002. Yeah, we went with the Sistina public license. And Alan Cox kind of threw a fit and forked GFS and made his own open GFS. And, a lot of that was, aside from the fork and the code and all that, it was a licensing dispute, right? Mm-hmm. How was the software licensed? What were the rules around how it could be used, modified, distributed, and what had to happen with the changes that were made by any other outside party, right?
Yeah.
And for the purposes of being able to be commercial without giving away your intellectual property, but also still be an open capability, right?
Yep.
I mean, that seems like an obvious use case for a blockchain would be a blockchain-based license model, right? Where the software consults and determines whether or not I'm in compliance with the license that is associated to this thing, and it can't be broken, right? Mm-hmm. You either can or can't, right? unless you were to get the seed and change the actual back end blockchain that would give you the thumbs up or the thumbs down. That would be, in my mind, that seems like a rather elegant way to solve what is ultimately a dispute over the interpretation of the meaning of a license or the intention legally of a license for software. Right, software licensing has been a problem since the beginning.
Yeah, quite a few applications of like cryptographically secure things in our world now that are so far underneath the covers that people don't know they're happening. The browser is doing TLS. Most people have no idea how that works or what it does. When you use an ATM and I hope the bits going across the phone line back to the bank should be encrypted using a strong cryptography, or secure boot and OSs of the newer PCs and servers now, making sure that they don't boot a rogue operating system, and that's more of a security. It's like a lot of little applications of cryptography, and every one of those there could be a blockchain play, for the right type of blockchain. And so if you wanted to say, like, let's say managing the keys for secure boot became a problem, because the way it is right now, when you buy a PC, it's got 5 keys in it or whatever, some finite number of keys, and unless you're really, really good at hacking BIOS, those are the keys it's going to have until it goes into the fire, after 10 years. So what if there was a way to distribute keys to the point where you could rotate them, and because rotating keys is always more secure, and you could like manage keys as actual keys. Maybe there's a blockchain play there where the PC had a way to update its keys, but it knew it got secure stuff based on the blockchain. Again, you could probably find another way to do that wasn't blockchain. So who cares?
Yeah, but blockchain just kind of becomes almost like the network medium by which you can communicate those things versus the means by which you officiate them. Right, the officiance is already sort of in its own way being done and handled by the cryptography and the.
We should talk more about Silk Road and the illicit uses of crypto. That's a lot more interesting.
I do want to make one point before we go in that direction, and that point is that I think that, I'm not very familiar with exactly like the open source blockchain coders and who's like, do they have the equivalent of a Linus? But I suspect that I think what the magic Linus had was to be both, to be both open and closed. In other words, he was pretty demanding and pretty, but he built a tribe.
Benevolent dictator.
Yeah, he was basically, as he said, benevolent. And I don't know, obviously many people argued that the other BSD flavored Unixes were technically better and Polaris was better, but I think that Linus had some kind of combination of charisma and some level of organizational skills that, and so I suspect the blockchain is probably similar.
I think the other Linuxes or Unices of the day, the clones of BSD or x86, 386 or whatever, x386. Anyway, those things, they weren't open. They might have called themselves open source, but most of them were making a play to make money selling their units. And they did not allow device driver manufacturers, for instance, to modify the code or make submissions in a relatively short order. And the reason Linux won is because you could go download the latest kernel, you could build it on your PC, and you could go buy new hardware. And there's a 9 out of 10 chance that even the newest stuff was going to have drivers built into the kernel. Unless it had like Win modems or shit like that back in the early days.
You need to buy a $100,000 SDK in order to be able to write a driver for it.
Right. So that was his.
I understand hardware registers, and I understand compute, and I understand the Linux kernel, and I have this piece of hardware that doesn't have a driver. I can write one.
Sure.
Right.
Nobody's going to stop me.
Well, the others did not allow that. They were like, oh, you have to sign all these agreements with us if you're going to give us a driver. You have to, we're going to get our lawyers involved. It was hard. So he took the friction away, and then he kind of crowdsourced it too. Just said anybody can send me a patch if they want to.
Sure.
And that made it frictionless. So
I think the cool factor. So it was also the cool factor plus essentially network effects, like you said. For Linux, you could get everything started to standardize around it, and I think to a certain extent, blockchain and Bitcoin are they've kind of that. First, the leader gets people. If they decide, okay, we're going to go with cryptocurrency, we'll go with the leader at the moment. But Dogecoin and all these others, Ethereum, etc., also making a play. So it reminds me of like the 2000 timeframe when
Yeah.
Linux was starting to dominate, but there was still a lot of other plays going on. So we'll see. I suspect there'll be, as usual with these kinds of things, there'll be a number one and a number two. x86, AMD, Intel, AMD, Unix, Linux, Windows. They'll be
1 or 2, and everybody else.
Yeah.
I mean, it is funny. It kind of exposes the ridiculousness of the grand social agreement we all have with regard to what does this thing equal in value, right?
Yeah.
So Doge was literally a joke, and it was done poorly. It was not. It was written quickly, and it's lacking security features. It's lacking all kinds of things that you might want in a cryptocurrency. Yet, people like the Shiba Inu, and so they're, it's a funny meme, and they go, oh, I'm going to buy some of that. It's cost me 1/1000th of a cent, so I'll buy $50 worth, and boom, look, I've got 10,000 of these things I can go tinker around with. Nobody expected that, all of a sudden it would become worth a cent, and then 10 cents, and then 40 cents. Nobody expected blockchain or Bitcoin would end up being worth $62,000 per coin.
Yeah.
Or everybody who had mined one as an experiment as a developer back in 2008, 9, 10, whenever it was first burgeoning.
Yeah.
And then lost their USB stick with their with their key on, and they have 5,000 coins, and they'll never be recovered because but you could have been 100,000-aire or a millionaire, and if only you had known that.
I remember when Bitcoin was like $200, and everyone was the funny story was the guy that had the 10,000 Bitcoin pizza. He convinced some pizza delivery guy, instead of paying him $10, he said, I'll give you 10,000 Bitcoins. And it turned out the pizza delivery guy was enough of a nerd that could figure out how to accept 10,000 Bitcoins at a time like that. And God bless him. I hope he still got them. That's pretty awesome. That's the deal of the century,
Yeah.
Best tip ever.
Yeah.
So would you guys have any opinions on sort of the technical, when people talk about Bitcoin, the Bitcoin proponents will say, the Satoshi is, basically rode off into the sunset, sold all his Bitcoins. There isn't like one entity that controls, corners the Bitcoin market. It's kind of considered, it's well respected as an open source project. It has a fixed number that there's only a fixed number of Bitcoins that will ever be created. So it seems to, but the critique and Elon Musk has been kind of going back and forth, has said the nature of this proof of work means that you end up burning some energy to create it. Do you have a concept? I think Tom, you had some opinions on Ethereum and some of these alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are inherent limitations to the way Bitcoin was designed, right? 21 million coins can never be produced, and that's it, right? So you have, and so that creates several sub effects, right? The more are mined, the bigger the hash to mine for the next one, and so the further you go, it's almost like an exponential increase in difficulty. Will we get to the end because there's only a finite number? Yeah, but if it wasn't limited at 21 million, what if it was limited at a 32-bit integer, right? I mean, we could probably exhaust the world's supply of energy trying to get to that number of coins produced, because at some point, it might take a small country to power the miners required to generate the one next block. So, there are probably, and there have been proposed many efficiency increases. The original Ethereum Classic suffered from some pretty critical scalability issues in the initial architecture, and then they came out with Ethereum 2.0, and that sort of took its place, right? Both still exist. You can still use Ethereum Classic and Ethereum 2.0, but by far the Ethereum 2.0 is the more popular because it solved some of those inherent problems. Now, with Bitcoin, it's almost the reverse, right? You're creating. So people talk about the gold and the gold standard. Well, gold standard, it's not like there's never more gold being mined. There's always more gold being mined. And we increase the rate of gold in circulation about 2% per year. So yeah, I mean, you could potentially find another big strike and have a large chunk of gold enter the market in one time if you were to find a vein or a large mine. But it's the inherent lack of more. There's never going to be more, and so that's where if we're talking about what money is, it's the scarcity of it. That's effectively all money is. Yeah. And so, at one point, there's, it's funny, there's, I think I'm not sure exactly where the island is. I think it's South Pacific somewhere, but their coinage was giant circular rocks. Those things didn't move, right? They were just stayed in place. And then, the transactions were etched on them and everybody knew where they were, but you can't steal it because it weighs 50 tons. And, so
it actually
everybody agreed, right? It's like the social agreement that
this is going to happen with Bitcoin, I think. As we keep going, it's going to be like gold's a great example. So I've heard and I believe that gold right now, the amount of gold that people think they own compared to the amount of gold that's actually sitting in vaults is something around 50% or less. Meaning people have sold the same gold multiple times. It's essentially a big old Ponzi scheme. And if everybody went to try and get their gold at once, there's just not enough gold to give everyone their gold. And it's kind of well known, and it sucks, and what's to keep Bitcoin from being the same thing, right? Unless you're doing your own Bitcoin wallet, aka having your own gold bars down in your gun safe, you don't really know that you've got your digital currency because it's you just have a ledger in an account of some place like cryptobank.com, Joe's Crypto Bank. So you're really just trusting them. So what's to keep them from selling the same Bitcoin, 6 times to 6 different people and no one really knowing because everyone just keeps it in the savings account. It's just like fractional reserve banking is going to come to Bitcoin just like it does to the American US dollar. It's going to be weird because there's like very little regulation and, who are you going to go after if they rip you off? That'll be stuff that keeps Bitcoin from growing. It'll be the scams that are built on top of it eventually.
Yeah. Well, and then, the obvious front running of people like Elon, people like Elon Musk are, it sure looks like they're front running, but.
Oh yeah, he's a big Dogecoin guy. I think that's more just, he thinks it's funny to watch. He's just a twisted, weird person.
It could be.
Elon, if you're watching.
Yeah, we'd love that.
Randy Ollinger.
Love your cars. Love your cars.
Yeah.
But
the reality is it'll be self-limiting, I think, in the end.
Well, yeah. I mean, but my understanding with Bitcoin is you can operate your own wallet, and so you can be part of the actual peer-to-peer open source.
Absolutely, and that's the equivalent of keeping the gold in your basement. But maybe 1% of the people that think they have Bitcoin do that. The rest just are using some Mt. Gox type exchange, which has gone bankrupt or has. There's been several of these where the people who started them just one day absconded with all the coins, and all the people standing around with their finger in there saying, "What happened to my Bitcoin?" There's like so little regulation. Some of them they found dead. It's a bit of a risk to get into it too.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous to play around with a currency that at the start was primarily used by the seedy underbelly of society, as its main constituents. You don't want to steal. You don't want to steal from those people. Really bad idea to steal from all of them at once.
But it's not unusual for certain, some innovations to come from that, that darker, that underworld, that's those
darker underworlds are always the first adopters of technology.
I think about the porn industry, right? I mean, there's.
I've heard.
Yeah.
And they move the needle on technology because that they have little to lose and lots to gain, and that's not always a dichotomy that people in, I will say, more legitimate or at least more transparent industries can afford. Right? If you've got a lot to gain, it stands to reason that there should be also a lot to lose. If that's not true, then you have an inherently lower risk. And if you have an inherently lower risk, then what's to stop you from doing that thing that that for anybody else would be risky, but you have no risk. So why not try it?
Yep. Absolutely.
No downside, only upside.
Well, it's why small companies often innovate. They often innovate more than big companies because the big companies are, they've built they've got their piece of the action and they essentially can collect interest off that action. They don't have to go hunting every day. So
there's not $1 billion to lose. There's only $1 billion to be made when you have nothing to start with.
There's if we want to talk about virtual currencies too, leaving aside, there are other virtual currencies out there that people just spin out of thin air and go sell.
Yeah.
These NFTs are an example of a virtual thing that means nothing that people are paying big money for. My favorite is, these carbon credits. It's like, oh, I'm going to go fly on a plane. I'm going to buy carbon credits, and it's a tradable commodity. But there's probably 30 places you can buy carbon credits from, and none of them are the same. They're all just spun out of straw. You know, and so the idea of creating virtual is not all that new.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of what we were talking about before the broadcast about art, right?
Yeah.
NFTs are kind of the new art in a way, right? Art
Yeah,
doesn't have any intrinsic value. It's only the content and what you determine the value to be.
I think those totally depend on the bigger fool theory. Like if you wanted to make money in NFTs and trying to sell them, you need someone that's dumber than you are to buy your
I mean, Tiger King himself is trying to sell NFTs for prison so he can afford his legal defense. What does that say about what the value of an NFT?
It's like when people. But Randy, when people complain about Bitcoin and say it's you can't do anything with it, it's just a hash, it's just a hash signature. It's kind of like, look at modern art, right? It doesn't really. There's really no aesthetic. There's no essentially aesthetic value add. It's often posing, whatever it is, but people pay millions for it. So the basic concept is that right or wrong? I don't know, but the basic concept is it's what people are willing to pay for something that's considered a scarce asset. And to be honest, I kind of look at Bitcoin, the fact that there's only a certain number of Bitcoins that can be created is kind of a feature, not a bug.
Because, it's deflationary. It means a certain percent will get lost every year, and then that number that are available for circulation will actually never hit the true number because there's already been millions of Bitcoins that disappeared. Not millions, I shouldn't say that. I don't know the number, but there are plenty of cases of people who are crying over their Bitcoin wallet.
Wow. Yeah. Interesting. Yep. Now, Randy, you brought up, so we've got about another 12 minutes or so. You were talking about the dark, more, I guess it would be called the dark web. Or
these Silk Roads and things like that.
Yeah. So how is that impact? Is that impacting kind of, the part of the world you guys live in? I mean, is it indirectly through giving hackers tools that can, go after enterprise?
I mean, certainly the dark web or whatever has nefarious things for sale. You can buy lists of passwords or, lots of probably, I don't want to go down. We can all estimate all the nasty in society that are for sale there. And Silk Road was a brilliant implementation of a transactional system for that for a while until the guy finally got caught, which is a great story if you ever want to read a very long article on how they tracked him down and got him. It was actually really, really interesting. Mm-hmm. But without that, the next one pops up. Someone can build another transaction system to, a storefront to go murder for hire.
I'd say
associate that with Bitcoin itself or crypto itself because it's a little bit because crypto has this anonymous capability that makes it a little more useful in those scenarios. Mm-hmm. But again, there's been people selling seedy stuff for millennia, so
somebody wants it, somebody else is going to find it and sell it.
They'll figure out a way to do transactions. It did make it easier, I'm sure, for a lot of the people that were into that. I never got a Tor account or never went on Silk Road.
There's a reason that saying cash is king exists, right?
Yeah. Yep. Actually, it's interesting that I could see governments coming up with their own cryptocurrency in the future, and cash will no longer be anonymous, purely so they can get around the underground economy, that doesn't exist. So I like when I go to a restaurant and, I tip my server, I try to always tip in cash. I'll pay the bill with my credit card, but I'll tip in cash. It's just my little way to stick the finger in the eye of the government a little bit because then they don't have to claim it. It's this big, but
it's interesting. Recently, I've been tipping, and then when I see my statement, I see the original charge but not the tip, and I'm like, what is that?
That's interesting. I don't know how they do that through a credit card transaction because those are all traceable. But point being is, I could see governments using digital currency, creating a dollar digital currency. I mean, why couldn't they, right? It might not be like a blockchain, but a centralized bank or centralized government could certainly create an electronic system that let people essentially move money around without. We're almost there. Like I can use my phone to pay for my coffee, and I can I can go online and use my credit card or Apple Pay and Samsung Pay, and there's people trying to figure out ways to exchange value without,
Yeah.
When was the last time we wrote a check, or
Yeah.
they're
Rare. Yep, it's rare these days.
So you bring that up. My barber only accepts cash and checks.
Yeah, because he's a smart barber.
And I was like, checks? Who's somebody still writing you a check for a haircut?
Anyway, cool. Well, hey, do you guys have any final thoughts? I think if you guys have any final thoughts or comments on any of the topics, blockchain or open source.
I say the article this morning about a guy named Brock Pierce who ran for president this year, and he was an early blockchain innovator, and now he's a multi-billionaire. And he's probably a wackadoodle weirdo, but he's an interesting story behind him. And advise people, if you're interested in the history of blockchain, go read his story, because he basically found a way to make money in the video game world by selling virtual things in video games and on eBay, so exchanging that for real currency. And then when crypto came out, he's like, well, this is the same thing. So he just went and bought all his money from his company he shut down, put it into crypto, and became a billionaire. It's like,
yep,
interesting play.
Yeah, there's a few of those.
There's a bold move.
Yeah, I mean,
it's really empty out my 401k and dump it all into Bitcoin, but
make sure your dollar cost average when you do that.
Yeah,
right. But I mean, seriously, if you think about it, the appeal is that it's pretty fungible. It's pretty. It appears that there's no central control. That isn't quite like Randy's point about essentially at the edges. There's sort of central control from the fulfillment, like the Coinbases or the Mt. Goxes, whoever's doing that. But fundamentally, it has the promise of sort of a very, movable, shareable asset that can be traded, that no one single entity controls, and nobody can dilute it. Nobody can.
And you can move it across borders of countries.
Yeah.
A way to keep it in a border. So governments would allow it if they could, but they just have no way to stop it.
You can get on a plane with more than $10,000 in cash, but I could carry around $25 million in Bitcoin.
Yep.
Yeah, that's true. And the other thing,
yep,
that's right. The other thing is that I think, and we talked about this before when we were prepping for this call and this broadcast, is basically, what we were saying earlier in the broadcast about people on the margins. Well, there's countries on the margins, right? Like in El Salvador or countries that historically have never really had hard currencies, right? Because governments have inflated or devalued for whatever economic crisis has to be met. So those countries, you're seeing a lot of blockchain adoption, and so that I think is going to be that, like you were saying. I think it was you, Andy, saying people that it's people that really need something, that have a hard problem. That's what pushes them to innovate or accept and move on innovations. Pressure works. So,
well, great.
Yep. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, very good. So again, appreciate you guys coming today, sharing your insights. There'll be another broadcast next week on Thursday. We also have let me start with our upcoming guest. So Ian Corner is an IT leader from the land down under from Australia. Randy and I have worked with him a bit on what are called data intensive workflows. And so Ian, probably sometime in the July timeframe, he works on some critical infrastructure and is quite busy at the moment. But the basic idea is to provide a way to build efficient workflows around data, to categorize it, to provide provenance, to provide long-term archiving, to provide mechanisms to share and distribute. And I think it's very, very interesting stuff. So he won't be on the June 24th broadcast, but I'm going to look for an announcement on that shortly. And with that, again, thanks for joining. Appreciate it. And guys, thank you again. And we will hopefully talk to you next week. Take care. Okay. Yep. Bye now.
Thanks, everybody.